excited to talk today to Dr. O'Shaughnessy from Conceptions Reproductive. I'm not going to say the full name because I'm going to get it wrong. Out in Colorado, and we're going to talk about what to expect when using a donor egg. So I will let you introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay, I'm Dr. O'Shaughnessy, and everybody calls me Dr. O because nobody can pronounce my name or spell it. And I'm a reproductive endocrinologist with Conceptions Reproductive Associates of Colorado. I'm also the director of the egg donor program. So today I wanted to go over what is entailed in choosing an egg donor, as well as the process associated with proceeding with an egg donor cycle. And how I usually start that out when I'm talking to patients is there's really two big arms that you start out with when you're choosing an egg donor: known versus anonymous. I would say majority of people choose the anonymous route because a known donor, some people just don't have the availability of a known donor, and that known donor can be a friend or it could be a family member. There's also other things that go into using a known donor, like having to involve legal, getting a contract signed. You have to, all people involved have to talk to a psychologist just to get all the things involved with an egg donor cycle hashed out. So anyway, once you make that decision, then we're kind of go through what the positives and negatives of going with a known donor versus an anonymous donor. So known donor, obviously the positives are you're not usually paying or compensating that known donor. So that's going to save on cost. You usually know the known donor, so that's nice. If it's a family member, there's a genetic link. And obviously the negatives are, it's hard to find a known donor who would be willing to do that for you. And you have to get legal involved. And that is, you have to go to a special lawyer that specializes in assisted reproductive technology law, and, draw up a contract so everyone is safe with the situation. So using an anonymous donor, and I would say again, most people choose an anonymous donor. Obviously, the positives are that you have a whole group of people that you're choosing from, so you can choose specific characteristics for that known donor. You have a wider variety of people that you're choosing from, sometimes over a larger geographic area, depending on what you go with, an agency versus an internal. So we'll start with an internal egg donor program. What does that mean? That means a fertility clinic that has its own internal egg donor program. There are donors available in that clinic. Not every clinic has that available, so usually there's some clinics that have to send you to an agency because they don't have that. For men who are a gay couple, I usually encourage them to do the donor process first. Many of them go to an agency and start with the gestational carrier piece first, but they really shouldn't, because that can cost a lot of money. You want to get your embryos before you go get your gestational carrier. Some gay men have a gestational carrier already, and obviously that's fine. But if you're going to go with an agency, then getting the embryos with an egg donor is the first thing that you should do. An internal program, what are the positives? The positives are you're not paying an agency fee. That is the big positive, because it can be quite costly. Usually with an agency, you're getting donors from a wider geographic area. So for example, if you choose a donor from another state, you are paying for her travel, you are paying for her expenses. So you have to incorporate the cost of that into when you're choosing an egg donor. The positives of an agency versus an internal is much wider variety of donors. So if you're looking for something very specific or characteristics that are hard to match, generally they have to go with an agency. For example, in Colorado, your ethnic groups are not there's not a variety of ethnic groups available as opposed to New York or LA. So your internal programs are going to reflect the population. So you're not going to get a lot of Asian donors or even African-American donors, even Black donors. So those are the things that you have to kind of consider when you're choosing a donor. But anyway, internal egg donor program, cost is going to be less, no agency fee. Those donors are already screened, right? So when you're choosing a donor with an agency, they're very briefly screened. You know, they have a very low criteria. But when that donor from the agency has to then be rescreened by the fertility clinic, meaning ovarian reserve testing, making sure they're a good egg donor, making sure they have a good number of eggs, blood work, infectious disease testing, psychologist. So many different things that have to occur once you pick an egg donor from an agency. It's not,
Yeah,
you have to get through that.
I think what I didn't know, and I think a lot of people probably don't, is that, because you think of a sperm bank and the sperm is there, it's done, like it's already there, it's already frozen, but these are fresh eggs, like
Correct.
most of the time, like most.
Yes, and we'll talk about that in a minute, about egg freezing. So that's a different level.
Yeah.
So that's a good thing about an internal program. They're already screened. They're on the portal. You look at them, they're screened. They don't have to go through further screening. In our program, we have two separate programs, sub-programs, so to speak. One is a full fresh egg donor cycle, which means that one recipient to one egg donor are matched. We also have a split program, one donor, two recipients. So the two recipients share the cost of that one egg donor. So the cost is substantially less, so more affordable, because an egg donor cycle can be quite expensive. However, less number of eggs, right? You're not going to get as many eggs because you're sharing it with someone else. So if you're looking to have 3 or 4 kids with this one egg donor cycle, don't do a split. Then there's the egg banks, right? So if you use an egg bank, that'll get you to transfer the fastest, right? Because you go to this egg bank, you choose your donor, the donor is done, so you don't have to worry about cancellation of the egg donor because it's a fresh cycle. They literally send a cohort of eggs, usually 6 to 8 is in one cohort of eggs that you're paying for. And then the payment usually is correlated with the donor, meaning if the donor has gone through before, if she's successful, obviously the cost usually is higher. They send the eggs to us. We fertilize it with the sperm of the intended parent or sperm donor, depending on what you're looking for. And then those embryos are grown in culture. They get to the blastocyst stage. You can either transfer that blastocyst fresh, or you can test the blastocyst and for chromosomal abnormalities, and then do a frozen embryo transfer. So very quick. The issue with egg bank is the pregnancy rates can be lower than using fresh. You're only getting a very small cohort of eggs. So there is potential that you do not get you don't get a blastocyst from that cohort. Now, there are refund guarantees that some of these egg banks have, but you have to be very careful as to what the guarantee is. So some guarantees will say, we guarantee that you thaw the eggs, they survive, and then you'll get one that fertilizes, which is not a great guarantee. Or you'll get a guarantee that you get one blastocyst transfer, but their definition of a quality blastocyst is going to be a lot different from what the fertility clinic considers. So there's a lot that goes into an egg freeze, a frozen egg cycle that you have to consider. But some people like that. Let's get it going. Let's get it done as quickly as possible. The cost of a frozen egg cycle is going to be the same as a split cycle. So definitely cheaper than a full fresh egg donor cycle. So what happens now that you've chosen where you're going to get your eggs from, agency, internal, or egg bank? So once you've made that decision and you're matched, what happens after that? So there's a big process that happens after that. So again, if the donor is coming from an agency, she has to be screened. So screening is criteria. We have criteria that we follow the American Society for Reproductive Medicine as to what we consider a good egg donor. There's age limitations, there's weight limitations, things like that. Recreational drugs, things like that. But screening is very similar in all places, hopefully. So it's infectious disease that's required by the FDA for any egg donor, and this is an FDA screening that they have to go through. Ovarian reserve testing, obviously very important. Make sure she's a good candidate, that her numbers are good. Some hormonal studies, genetic carrier screening to make sure she doesn't carry any mutations. Now, if she does, it doesn't disqualify her. However, the recipient can't carry the same mutation, right? So obviously, if she's positive for any mutations, then the recipient has to be tested for those particular mutations, make sure they don't match. Or the sperm donor, or the intended parent, the male, the sperm, whoever's providing the sperm, obviously. Karyotype, which is her chromosomes, make sure she has normal chromosomes. She has to see a psychologist, make sure she's okay to proceed with an egg donor cycle. So a lot goes into her screening, but also the intended parent to be screened. So semen analysis, again, we have to do infectious disease testing. If the couple, usually a gay couple, or doesn't have to be a gay couple, if they're using a gestational carrier, they have to do FDA testing as well, because that embryo is going to go into someone else, right? So those are the main things. And of course, the female her uterus has to be screened, make sure she's good to go with the frozen transfer. So there's that screening for the intended parents. Once all the screening is done, then the donor can proceed through with her IVF cycle. So an IVF cycle is very basic. Usually there's 1 month of suppression, and that's usually a birth control pill for that egg donor. It's not a whole month. It's usually anywhere from 16 to 21 days. And then she starts her stimulation. So the stimulation cycle is using fertility medications. That's over a period of approximately 10 days. Now, it could be 12 days, it could be 8 days, depending on how she responds. And then once the follicles are ready, she's triggered. Trigger just means she gets that LH surge that occurs before releasing your eggs. We then do the retrieval before egg release. So we want to make sure those eggs are mature. That's what the trigger does. It matures the eggs. And then the eggs are fertilized with the sperm. Now, there's 2 ways to fertilize an egg. One is with just natural insemination, meaning taking sperm, washing it, putting it next to the egg to let it do its thing, versus ICSI, which is to inject the sperm into the egg. And that's center dependent. We don't do natural fertilization. We only do ICSI in our clinic. But again, it varies from IVF center to IVF center. If you are doing chromosomal testing on the embryos, you must do ICSI, so that they have to inject the sperm into the egg, if that is the case. The next day, you'll know how many eggs fertilized. Now, what you have to understand is what you start with. Like when they call you and say, oh, the donor has 20 eggs developing. You're not going to get 20 eggs from the retrieval, and not all of them will be mature. So this is where the attrition happens, and that's even in egg donors. And not all the mature eggs are going to fertilize. We can't use immature eggs. We toss those. We discard those. So the day after the retrieval, you'll know how many fertilized. So obviously, the day of the retrieval, whatever sperm you're using, obviously they have to provide usually a fresh specimen, but it can be a frozen specimen. So obviously sperm, if it's in a sperm donor, it's frozen. Usually it's fresh if it's not a sperm donor. So next day you'll know how many fertilized, and then they just leave those in culture to divide. Now, most centers in the United States let those embryos sit in culture for 5, 6, or 7 days. In the old days, we only kept them in culture to day 3. That's an old technique. There may be some places where they still do that. I don't know. That generally with the donor cycle, that should not be happening. Anyway, so 5, 6, or 7, they have to get to the blastocyst stage. So what is that? That's a stage of development that you can actually tell where the placenta is forming. That's called the trophectoderm, and where the inner cell mass, that's the actual fetus. That's where, so we can actually tell where those things are happening. The reason why that's important, because when you test the embryo, you will obviously take cells from the area of the placenta, not the inner cell mass. You don't want to mess with that area, right? So at that point, you can either transfer fresh, in which case, if that is the case, then the recipient should have already been on medications or be ready for transfer at that point. So there's a little bit of there's a little bit more work involved in that, because you have to kind of make sure that everything is happening at the same time between the two. So most centers, I would say, a lot of centers don't transfer fresh in these situations. They'll do a frozen transfer, just easier to manipulate the schedule. But you can transfer fresh if that person is ready, if her uterus has been prepared. Or you can freeze the embryos and then freeze the blastocyst. So you freeze the blastocyst. If they were tested, meaning if they were biopsied, you wait for those results to come back to see which of the embryos are chromosomally normal. Now, what everyone has to understand is that even egg donors, young, healthy, good ovarian reserve, will have abnormal embryos. And there's no way to know that unless you test those embryos. It could be up to 30% of those embryos are abnormal, 30 to 40%, even in an egg donor. So we wait for that, and then obviously transfer the chromosomally normal embryos. If you choose not to test, then obviously what's going to happen is they'll look at those embryos, see which ones are the best quality, what we call morphology, and then transfer the best one. And that brings us to number to transfer. So again, what everyone has to understand is these are, young donors with very nice embryos usually. And so we encourage people to transfer 1 embryo at a time. We do not want people to have more than 1 pregnancy at a time. It's much safer, a lot less risk involved with that. Now, for the couples that are using gestational carriers, usually what happens is once they get their embryos, then they start the process of choosing the gestational carrier, matching with the gestational carrier. And again, that could be a known person, or it can be through an agency. But that's a whole other, big conversation. The frozen transfer, generally prior to a frozen transfer, obviously there's a lot of testing of the uterus. So there's more uterine testing to make sure everything is good before we put the embryo in. That prep time can be as much as 6 weeks after the retrieval to actually put that embryo in. So there's a lot that goes into that. We want all the hormones out of their system and do testing of the uterus. That could be a trial embryo transfer. That's an embryo transfer without the embryo. We do Dopplers here, which is just to look at the blood flow to the uterine cavity. A hysteroscopy. Some places do sonohistograms, and that's just to look at the inside of the uterine cavity before we do the transfer. So that happens after we get embryos and before the transfer. So
right, but you can do it simultaneously, because for us, we did reciprocal IVF, so we got my uterus ready before we went through my wife's retrieval, so that we could do.
Oh, so you did a fresh transfer.
We did a fresh transfer.
Okay. Yes. So uterine testing would happen obviously before that, because you're scheduling together to make sure that your uterus is ready.
Yeah.
When she's ready to, after her retrieval, your uterus is ready for transfer. Yeah. So fresh is a very different process. Well, that's yeah.
Yeah. So, so
We
people do have options.
Yes, definitely have options. We do very few fresh transfers because I would say most of our couples do chromosomal testing of the embryos.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we clearly did
As a matter of fact, there was a recent study in I think it was in JAMA, which is a Journal of American Medical Association, which is great, great journal, looking at comparing fresh versus frozen in an egg donor cycle. And what they find with egg donors, it seems as though the pregnancy rate may be a little higher with a fresh transfer, which is what you're referring to.
Oh, yeah.
It hasn't been substantiated with other with other research data.
Right.
But
it's hard to tell. It's kind of like hard to test it out,
yes.
But for us,
Yes.
both of our kids were fresh
Oh,
transfers because our frozen didn't work, so we had to go through another retrieval, and the fresh were the best for us. So
yes, and and you're right. It is, so for some people is the way to go. Obviously, what I always say: do your research, do your research, do your research. So choose the best agency. Even though you get a list of agencies maybe from your IVF center, don't assume that those agencies are for you. You have to do your own research. The IVF centers, make sure you look at their pregnancy rates. Just because you're going through an egg donor cycle doesn't mean that you're going to get pregnant 100%. It's definitely never 100%. So you have to look at their data, go on the website. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, will have pregnancy rates for IVF centers. Look for take-home baby rates, not just pregnancy rate, because really what matters is, are you taking home a baby? So that live birth is the way to go. Yes.
Yeah. There's so much that goes into fertility.
So it sounds like a lot of work, but if you work with a good agency, or if you work with a good IVF center, it's amazing how quickly it goes, and how seamless it is. But you have to go with the center that kind of holds your hand and takes you through it. We have a great egg donor team, and that's all they do. Just work with egg donors and gestational carriers. Basically, is what they do. So the nurses know everything about everything.
I feel like I read something that doesn't conceptions have like one of the highest live birth rates in the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I read something about.
So when you compare us to other centers in the nation, those centers will do over 100 frozen transfers a year. We have the highest. We have the highest live birth rates. Yeah,
it's amazing. It's amazing.
For quite a few years. I think it's 4 or 5 years that we've highest. Yeah,
it's great. I know. I always say in all these videos, but you are interviewing your clinic.
Yes, you absolutely, 1000%.
It's
ask your questions. Have your questions ready. Make a list.
I did.
Go to Resolve. Go to ASRM. They have their own website. Develop the questions that you think are important, and definitely ask. Yes,
yeah, because it's such
expensive, and you want to know that you're doing the right thing, right?
And it's a very emotional journey, and it can be. So you want to make sure that where you're going, that the people that you're working with are empathic and really going to be there for you. I mean, I cried on the phone to my doctor countless times, and it can be hard, and just to be prepared for that, but to make sure that you have your team lined up of people who are going to support you and take care of you, because the end goal is taking home your baby, a healthy baby.
Exactly, a healthy baby. That's what I tell people when they want to put 2 embryos in. I said, you want a healthy baby.
But it's so funny because there's so many. I feel like there's so many gay male couples with twins because it's so expensive, and it's like, let's just.
And I would say, out of all the people that we transfer to, I would say that would be the most common, where we understand their situation, that how expensive each cycle is. Yeah. There are some places that won't put more than one embryo into a gestational carrier. There's some IVF centers that just won't. They don't feel it's necessary to put a GC at higher risk.
Right.
particularly because she's a gestational carrier.
Right.
So, but twins is high risk, you know, no matter how you look at it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the embryo
Oh.
split. So
That was my
put two in, you
biggest
could have
fear. That
three.
was my biggest fear. I would email my doctor all the time. I'm like, I feel something. I feel like there's two.
It happens. It happens.
I'm the crazy one.
It's actually rare. It's like 2%, 1 to 2%. We manipulate, you know, embryos. So, you know, we, you know, do assisted hatching, which is to poke a hole in the zona pellucida, which is the shell. We biopsy embryos. That puts a little higher risk of splitting.
Yeah, we had my daughter was ICSI. My son
Mhm.
wasn't, but my daughter was. And I was like, I read a study that said when you poke that hole in there, they think I'm crazy. They think I'm crazy there.
That's okay.
Yeah. But anyway, we had singletons, thank God, healthy singletons.
Excellent.
But
Excellent.
thank you so much for your wisdom
Oh, you're
and
very
sharing
welcome.
this information. There's so much that
Absolutely.
goes into it, and
Absolutely.
you know, education's empowering, and just knowing what you're
Absolutely.
about to embark on, I think is so helpful. So thank you.
All right.
You.
Will do. Thank
All
you.
right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye now.